The first time I set foot in Camp Desert Rock, the Nevada air felt like sandpaper scraping across my skin. Nothing but dust and miles of cracked, sun-baked earth. My orders were clear. Observe nuclear tests, report findings, follow protocol. As a U.S. Army aviator and civil engineer, I was trained to adapt, to make sense of any terrain or task. But this place was something else. A no-man's land, hollow and eerie, with the distant tremor of atomic explosions humming in the background like a quiet, menacing heartbeat. In those early days, we were fed stories about the greater good, about advancing our country's might. So, I buried the unease that stirred in my gut and focused on the mission. Those tests weren't like anything I'd ever seen. They started with a burst of light that seemed to split the world open, followed by the slow, dark rise of a mushroom cloud. We stood there, feeling the earth tremble underfoot, watching something almost biblical in its fury. Then came the shockwaves, rolling toward us like an invisible hand, powerful enough to knock a man off his feet. At first, I'd chuckle along with the guys, trying to play it cool, but the sheer power we were dealing with wasn't something you could shake off with laughter. It wasn't long before I noticed the first signs, the black spots on my skin, like ink stains spreading slowly across my body. I figured it was a rash, something from the dry desert air or the grit that seemed to seep into every pore. But then my teeth began to ache, and I knew something was off. That's when I saw a group of men in dark suits standing off in the distance, away from the other soldiers. They didn't blend in. They didn't even try. Their eyes followed us, cold and unblinking. I told myself they were just government types, some intelligence agency sent to keep an eye on the tests. But there was something about them, something that left a chill I couldn't shake. At night, lying in my bunk, I couldn't help but think about those men. I wondered if they were watching me specifically, or if I just imagined it all. My skin felt raw, my bones aching in ways I'd never experienced before. No one else talked about it, not directly. It was like we'd all silently agreed to keep our heads down, to pretend everything was fine. But I could see the changes in the other men. The pallor in their faces, the way they kept to themselves, quiet and withdrawn. Each day, my reflection in the mirror looked more like a stranger, like someone slowly fading away. One evening, I caught sight of Lieutenant Henry Taylor, my closest friend out here, leaning against his Jeep, staring out across the horizon. We didn't speak much, but there was a heaviness in his gaze that mirrored my own. He knew, just as I did, that something was very wrong. "John, you think they tell us everything we're breathing in?" he muttered, his voice barely audible over the desert wind. I had no answer, but his question lingered, adding to the unease gnawing at my core. As I walked back to my quarters, I felt a familiar gaze on me. Those men in black suits were there again, standing just beyond the perimeter, their silhouettes sharp against the fading light. I tried to ignore them, to push away the creeping paranoia, but I knew deep down that this place, these tests, and those men were all tied to something I didn't understand. And as the Nevada night settled around me, the desert felt like it was swallowing me whole. The pain in my bones was like a slow poison, creeping deeper each day. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing, but I wasn't fooling anyone, not even myself. The black spots had grown, and now they weren't just on my arms but spreading across my chest, my neck. Some days, the migraines were so intense I could barely see straight, and I'd find myself gripping the edge of the table just to stay upright. I kept it to myself, but I wasn't the only one looking worse for wear. I'd catch sight of the other guys, shadows of themselves, quiet and withdrawn, as if some unseen weight was pressing us all down. One night, I was alone in my bunk, listening to the hum of the desert wind against the barracks when I felt it, that prickling on the back of my neck. I glanced toward the window, and there they were again, men in dark suits, standing in the shadows just beyond the perimeter fence, barely visible in the moonlight. They didn't move, didn't even blink, as if they were carved from stone. I closed my eyes, hoping it was just a trick of the light, but when I opened them, they were still there, watching. That night, sleep was out of the question. I lay awake, wrestling with a growing fear I couldn't shake, a dread that ran deeper than I'd ever felt before. In the following days, paranoia took root, twisting itself into my every thought. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not just by those men outside the fence, but by the very walls around me. Every creak, every shuffle outside my door sent a shiver down my spine. I stopped talking to the other soldiers, kept to myself, and every time I glanced up, it felt like someone's eyes were on me. Henry, my only real friend here, noticed. "John, you're looking spooked," he said one day, his eyes full of concern. But what could I tell him? That I felt like I was disappearing, piece by piece, under the weight of something I couldn't understand? It wasn't just the illness. It was as if my mind was turning against me. The days blurred together, each one an endless loop of dread and isolation. I'd catch myself staring at nothing, my mind blank, only to snap out of it with my heart racing, unsure of how long I'd been lost in my thoughts. I tried to pull myself together, to act like the officer I was trained to be, but every time I looked in the mirror, I saw a stranger staring back, hollow-eyed and pale, a man haunted by shadows both within and without. One evening, after another long, silent day, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed a break, something to clear my head, so I went to Major Owens and told him I was heading into town, just to grab a drink, maybe feel a bit of normalcy for a change. He barely looked up, his expression indifferent, as if he already knew I wouldn't be coming back. The thought chilled me, but I pushed it aside and headed toward the main gate, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts and fears I couldn't shake. As I walked through the base, the men in black suits were there, waiting at the edge of the shadows. They didn't follow, didn't speak, but their silent presence was enough to remind me that whatever lay beyond Camp Desert Rock might be no safer than what I was leaving behind. The desert night stretched out before me, vast and empty, a dark reminder that I was, in many ways, already lost. And as I took those first steps toward town, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping out of one nightmare and straight into another. When my brother Frank got the news, they barely told him anything. "Lieutenant John Harding," they said, "presumed AWOL." That was it. No explanations, no details. Just a cold statement that hung in the air, stripping me of everything I'd worked for, reducing my life to a single word: deserter. But Frank knew me better than anyone. He knew that whatever was going on, I wouldn't just walk away from my post, from my duty. He made it his mission to find out the truth, to bring me back, even if it meant fighting a system that seemed determined to keep us both in the dark. Frank traveled out to Camp Desert Rock, determined to get answers. He met with Major Owens, who seemed shaken by my disappearance, though he wouldn't say much. But Frank could read between the lines. Owens mentioned suspicious behavior, talked about my paranoia, but Frank sensed there was more to it. He pressed for details, asking about my work, about the men who'd been around me. Owens was evasive, but the one thing he did share, that I'd mentioned seeing men in black suits before I left, only deepened Frank's suspicion. He left that meeting with a gut feeling that the military wasn't telling him everything. A few weeks later, the news came through. My car had been found in Death Valley, abandoned miles from any road or town. Frank drove out there, his heart heavy with dread, yet clinging to hope. The desert stretched endlessly, vast and unforgiving, just as it had for me. When he reached the site, he saw my car half buried in sand, doors open, empty. Wildlife wardens who'd found it told him it looked as if someone else might have been there. A pile of cigarette butts that didn't seem like mine, left by the driver's side. Frank examined the scene carefully, noting every detail, piecing together what little he could. It was as if I'd vanished into thin air, leaving only a shell behind. Frank returned to Camp Desert Rock, determined to question the officers again, but he found nothing but roadblocks. Military personnel were suddenly tight-lipped, their responses growing colder, more rehearsed. Every question he asked was met with the same scripted answers. "Lieutenant Harding went AWOL. We have no further information." The more he pushed, the more he felt the wall closing in, as if the army had decided it was done with the matter, ready to bury it, and me, under layers of official silence. Yet Frank couldn't let it go. He knew I wouldn't walk away, not without a reason, not unless something or someone had forced my hand. Every night, he combed through his notes, reliving our conversations, trying to find any clue I might have left behind. He thought about the strange men I'd mentioned, the dark suits, the growing paranoia that had taken hold of me. The pieces didn't add up, but he kept at it, convinced that somewhere, buried in all the silence, was the answer. Days turned into weeks, and Frank began to wonder if he'd ever find me. He wasn't just fighting against a mystery. He was fighting the weight of a machine that could make a person disappear without a trace, leaving behind only questions. But he refused to give up. Somewhere out there, he was sure, was the truth of what had happened to me. And no matter how long it took, he would keep searching, keep fighting, until he brought me back or at least made sure the world knew my name again. Not as a deserter, but as a brother and a soldier who had simply wanted to do his duty. Frank never stopped. Even as the years dragged on and leads dried up, he wouldn't let my memory fade into a footnote in military records. The government may have marked me AWOL, but to Frank, that was nothing more than a label, a stamp used to keep people quiet. He was convinced something sinister had happened, and he wouldn't let me be silenced. He combed through every record, hunted down every scrap of information. He contacted other families who had lost loved ones to the same desert assignments, including one who had just lost Henry Taylor, my closest friend and fellow aviator. Henry had vanished under eerily similar circumstances, another soldier swallowed by the same shadows that had taken me. Frank started pressing harder, filing complaints, requesting documents, challenging the military's narrative. But it was like trying to wrestle a ghost. For every scrap of information he uncovered, it seemed a dozen more were locked away, marked classified, or simply lost. Still, he kept going. He managed to unearth files about radiation exposure and personnel lists that hinted at unusual surveillance. The men in black suits were mentioned here and there, whispers that suggested a covert government operation, one far beyond anything Frank, or anyone else, was meant to understand. Yet, despite these threads, he could never pin down a single, undeniable truth. One of the most chilling discoveries was an internal report stating that my disappearance was consistent with AWOL activity, but was marked unresolved. Frank knew that word was nothing more than a smokescreen. It was a way of saying that they had given up on finding answers, not that there weren't any. He fought for years to have my case reopened, demanding justice, asking for my name to be cleared. But he was met with blank stares and polite refusals from military offices, as if my story had never mattered, as if I had never even existed. It took over 2 decades for Frank's relentless push to get any real traction. By then, he'd gathered enough evidence, witness accounts, and questions that even the Army couldn't ignore him. The Army Board of Corrections finally agreed to hear his case. Frank presented everything he had, recounting my loyalty, my love for service, and the strange events leading up to my disappearance. He spoke about the men in black suits, the health issues I suffered after nuclear testing, the growing paranoia that plagued me in those final weeks. It was his last chance to restore my name, to wipe away the word deserter that had haunted him for so long. In the end, Frank's persistence paid off, at least partially. The board couldn't ignore the inconsistencies, the strange disappearances, the mounting suspicions. They agreed to change my status from deserter to died in the line of duty. But even that resolution came with a bitter taste. There were no details, no explanations, and no formal acknowledgement of what might have truly happened to me. It was a victory on paper, but for Frank, it was a hollow one. He'd fought for 25 years to bring me home in some way, but he was left with as many questions as answers. Frank never got the closure he deserved, and neither did I. Somewhere in the vast, sun-bleached sands of Camp Desert Rock, or in the classified vaults of military records, the truth remains buried. But thanks to Frank, at least my memory was given back its honor, even if my story remains unfinished. And perhaps that's how it has to be. My fate tied forever to the shadows of that Nevada desert, where secrets hide in plain sight and answers vanish as quickly as those who seek them.